race and ethnicity. Is there a difference? From the argument so far, it may seem that race and ethnicity are distinct concepts. They are, however, two sets of reasons why some people might argue that they are the same. For some who do not effectively distinguish between race and ethnicity, they argue that race should be jettisoned as a term with too much individuous history. They prefer to talk about ethnic relations and ethnic minorities, or, less often, majorities. It is often forgot that, for example, Anglo-Saxon North Americans are just as ethnic as Italian Americans. A variant on this view argues that ideas of race may or may not form part of ethnic ideologies, and their presence or absence does not seem to be a decisive factor. Antheus and Yuval Davis do distinguish between race and ethnic modes as modes of social categorization, but also see racism as the discourse and practice of inferiorizing ethnic groups. The second set of reasons is more complex, and I will argue through it before returning to the first problem. The dismantling of the biological concept of race and its general acceptance, at least in social sciences, as a social construction has brought about a recognition of the mutability of race. The comparison between North and Latin America discussed earlier is an example. Racial identities are now seen in somewhat the same way as ethnic identities. They are contextual, situational, and multivocal. This view is an inevitable result of seeing races as social constructions, by which their nature must depend on shifting social relations. But more recently, it also owes a lot to post-structuralist and postmodernist social theories. See Chapter 5. Very briefly, these have led to a critique of a concept of identity as an essential entity, based on the Enlightenment version of the subject as a sovereign, autonomous, rational actor. Freudian theories of the subconscious, Marxist theories of the determination of human consciousness by economic structures, and French structuralist theories of the existence of innate structures of human consciousness, which underlie diverse cultural expressions, all have undermined the Enlightenment view of the subject, and led to current views of the subject as a fragmented, multiple, unstable, and decentered. A corollary of this anti-essentialist view of identity, a person, and even less a group or category, does not have an underlying essence that defines overall characters. Whites are internally heterogeneous groups. Like subjects, these categories are fragmented and decentered. That is, they have no defining center. In this view, then, races are like ethnic groups. It may be objected that racial identifications cannot be as flexible as this sort of view implies. Social categories that use physical bodily cues to assign identities do not see that open to decentering. There are two issues here. The first is that bodily cues can be used to mean different things. Thus, a certain skin tone and hair texture in the US might mean black, while in Latin America it might mean mulatto. Bodies themselves are socially constructed. In addition, bodies are not immutable. Plastic surgery is the most obvious example, but hair straightening, skin lightening, and sun tanning are all ways of altering the body that can have an impact on racial identification. And Michael Jackson is only a recent example. The second issue is that anti-essentialism does not necessarily contest the apparent fixity of racial identifications. Rather, the point is the fact that someone is black or white or indigenous does not therefore say anything about that person. She or he may also be young or old, female or male, homosexual or heterosexual, rich or poor, and so on. There are cross-cutting identifications. Thus, the point remains that racial identifications seem similar to ethnic identifications. Both are partial, unstable, contextual, fragmentary. My view is that a distinction based on the approaches to race and ethnicity that I have argued for above is worth maintaining, although I admit that it cannot be a radical one. The distinction should not be the racial identifications imposed by a majority on the discriminating minority, while ethnic ones are chosen by in-group members for themselves. Instead, my point is that to deny a specific role to racial identifications, as Erickson does, or discriminations based on them, as Antheus and Yuval Davis do, is to blur the particular history by which these identifications come to have the force they do. And to identify oneself or others as Serb in Eastern Europe is to invoke a particular, relatively local history. To identify oneself or others as Black, Indian, or Indigenous in most of the Western world is to invoke, distantly or immediately, a long history of colonial encounters, slavery, discrimination, resistance, and so on. This does not mean that ethnic histories cannot be long and conflicted, but I think it is necessary to highlight the history of race by calling it by its name. And neither does this approach mean that racial identifications or racisms everywhere are the same, or that if racism departs from the biological version of late 19th century scientific racism, it does not really qualify as racism. An implication of some accounts, for example, that treat scientific racism as a kind of ideal type. There are different racisms, but in my view, they are linked historically in varied ways to that history of colonial encounters. The meanings attributed even nowadays to Black or white in South America, the Caribbean, South Africa, Europe, the US, and also Australia are not independent of each other nor of that history. Racism today in much of Europe, for example, is different from earlier versions in that it depends less on attribution of biological inferiority, although these have not disappeared either. Instead, the so-called new or cultural racism depends on ideas about deeply ingrained cultural differences. Yet many of the current images of Blacks, whites, Asians, etc. resonate with previous images. Race has been, as Goldberg puts it, buried alive. Racial and ethnic identifications do, however, overlap, both analytically and in practice. At an abstract level, both race and ethnicity involves a discourse about origins and about the transmission of essences across generations. Racial identifications use aspects of phenotype as a cue for categorization, but these are seen as transmitted intergenerationally, through the blood, so that ancestral origin is important. Likewise, ethnicity is about origin in a cultural geography, in which the culture of a place is absorbed by a person, almost into the blood, from a previous generation. On a more practical level, if ethnicity invokes local location in a cultural geography, it may be the case that the phenotypical traits used in racial discourse are attributed across that geography. In Colombia, for example, Blacks are located in certain parts of the country. Also, ethnic identifications may be made within a single racial category and vice versa, so that any individual can have both racial and ethnic identities. Race, ethnicity, and class. A final theoretical area that needs to be broached is that of the relation between race, ethnicity, and class. Here I shall refer mainly to the debates about the relation between class and race, since theoretically this has been the main terrain of dispute and because the issues under debate are basically the same for the case of ethnicity. I will refer to some Latin American literature because much of the debate has occurred outside of the context of Latin America, and because in subsequent chapters I will be looking in detail at race, ethnicity, and class in Latin America. The parameters of this debate were defined by discussion for, against, and within Marxism. The central question was whether race could be explained in terms of class, or more broadly, economics. A classic Marxist approach to race argued that the underlying determinant of capitalist societies is the opposition between owners of capital, the bourgeoisie, and the non-owners, the proletariat. This division, while not fully developed historically, determines much of what happens at all levels in society. Racial categories must be related to this division, and if they exist, it is because the bourgeoisie has created them in order to A. better dominate a particular fraction of the workforce who are categorized as naturally inferior and only good for manual work, and B, divide the workers into antagonistic racial categories, and thus rule them more effectively. In these arguments, the origins of racism were located in the class relations of colonialism, and the basic functions of race remain essentially the same over time. This is a simplified version of the classic Marxist argument, but it set up one extreme in the debate. Critics of this position might admit that domination of labor and divide and rule tactics were an important part of racially stratified systems, and they might admit the colonial origins of racism, but they attack the crude class reductionism of this approach. For a start, it is clear that racial categories can affect economic factors, and we shall see in the next chapter the fact that Africans became slaves while Native Americans were formally exempted from this category was due, among other things, to ideas about Africans and Native Americans. Thus, the determination runs both ways. Second, the way that racial identifications have changed over time, even in one capitalist country, cannot be explained easily in terms of changing class structures. Thus, changing in racial relations in the U.S. during this century, for example, legal desegregation, while they may be related to changing needs of capitalists for a better skilled and more flexible workforce, are also products of the Black resistance as blacks, more than as Black workers, and the dismantling of scientific racism. Third, racism becomes an element of false consciousness and misapprehension of reality. Either the bourgeoisie invests in it and imposes it on the global working class, or the working class somehow invent it for themselves. Neither option really captures the power and reality of racial identification in daily life. Fourth, class diversity within the oppressed racial category is hard to account for. For example, the position of middle-class blacks. Over the years, Marxist-oriented writers shifted positions in a variety of ways to take account of these problems. In broad terms, the tendency has been to attribute more autonomy to racial factors, seeing them as having an impact on economic and class structures and not as reducible to class determinations. Racism could be seen as an ideology which paradoxically, as Anthony and Yuval Davis pointed out, actually determines the location of racialized groups in the class structure. The Marxist starting point is more or less reversed in that ideology is determinant. John Rex, taking a Weberian Weberian approach is that close to some revisionist Marxist positions argued a similar line. Other approaches, not necessarily divorced from Marxist influences, have tried to avoid the idea that racism is merely ideology that intervenes, however autonomously, in class relations. For them, race is a level of experience and a cultural reality in its own right. Thus, for Gilroy, the struggle of blacks in Britain for civil rights or against police harassment is a part of the working class is constituted a political force. In an echo of Hall's resonant phrase that race is the modality in which classes live, Gilroy asserts that the post-colonial economic and social crisis of Britain is lived through a sense of race. Omi and Wynand oppose all forms of class reductionism and instead analyze racial formations and racial products as sui generis phenomena that may be related to class factors, but in which people have their own interests and goals that are defined in terms of racial identifications and meanings. More recent approaches, then, have tended to move away from treating race and class as two distinct sets of relationships, which interconnect in some essential way, and which are involved in some kind of mutual determination. Rather, and it is a part of postmodernist move away from big theories of social thought, such as Marxism, which try to encompass all phenomena with one totalizing and inevitably reductionist explanation. The emphasis is on the multiple ways in which people may identify differences in sameness, struggle, mobilize, and make alliances and enmities. Feminist theory has been an important force in moving in this direction, both in terms of social theory and political action, showing, for example, that black women have different interests from black men or Asian women from white women. This has led, particularly in the US and Europe, but increasingly in Latin America, to debates about the cultural politics of identity and difference, which some claim distract attention from basic issues of economic inequality. Issues of economic exploitation and inequality have taken on greater force in the wake of neoliberal policies in Latin America and worldwide, which have opened markets to global trade, reduced state protection and welfare, pushed down wages for the poorest sectors of the labor force, and increased poverty. In this context, Goldberg insists on recognizing race and racism as vital forces in today's world, and sees them as global forces that, as arguably as they have always done, operate across national boundaries. He challenges what he identifies as the tendencies of neoliberalism to mark all talks of race and racism, focusing instead on the individual or culture, and diverting attention from structural forces of oppression, which involve race but also class. Thus, he equally insists on grasping the political economic domination and inequality and resistance that race and racism involve, rather than focusing on cultural identities. In this sense, then, the debate has been reshaped, but it has not gone away. Conclusion. The arguments arrayed above will be important in examining race and ethnicity in Latin America. The differences and similarities between the categories Black and Indian, for example, cannot be understood without a clear idea of what racial and ethnic identifications involve. It has often been argued that Black is a racial identification while Indian is an ethnic one. I will be arguing that the difference is not quite so straightforward, nor can the differences and similarities between Latin America and the U.S. in terms of racial identities and racism be grasped without knowing what these terms mean. Again, it has commonly been said that the U.S. is or was the home of real racism, a deep racism based on genetics, while Latin America is characterized by a more superficial racism of appearance or phenotype. I will argue that such an opposition is misleading.